This is part 8, and probably the final part of the read-through for Karen L. King's What is Gnosticism work that she wrote back in 2023, back in 2003, or it was published back in 2003 or so. So let's get to it. The end of Gnosticism? Question mark. What will happen now to the category of Gnosticism? In the end, I think the term Gnosticism, quote unquote, will most likely be abandoned, at least in its present usage. Perhaps scholars will continue to use it to designate a much more delimited group of materials, such as Sethian Gnosticism, quote unquote, or classical Gnosticism, quote unquote. Perhaps not. It is important not so much to eliminate the term per se, but to recognize and correct the ways in which reinscribing the discourses of orthodoxy and heresy distort our reading and reconstruction of ancient religion. These distortions have both confused historiography and undermined the legitimate work of theological reflection. Having recognized the old frameworks' entanglement with anti-Catholic Protestant polemics, anti-Judaism, and colonial ideology that we have no desire to support, we can divide more adequate frameworks to address the many issues of our own post-colonial pluralistic world, as well as to provide enriched resources for fuller appreciation of the historical and theological wealth of Christianity, Judaism, and other ancient religions. By perceiving how thoroughly the study of Gnosticism is tied to defending normative Christianity, we have been able to analyze where and how the academic study of Gnosticism in the 20th century reinscribes and reproduces the ancient discourse of orthodoxy and heresy. We can also see shifts in that discourse where modern discourses of historicism and colonialism have intersected it. Such shifts fit very comfortably into the pattern of Michel Foucault that has led us to expect when examining the history of discourse. Rather than linear lines of causal continuity, we see substitutions, transformations, disjunctions, incompatibilities, and entanglements. Gnosticism was substituted for heresy as the object of discourse. The functions of this object were transformed, at times still working to establish Christian identity, but now in the face of new contestations and new definitions of normativity, such as those raised by Protestant Catholic disputes or Orientalism and its colonial enterprises, leading to notable disjunctions and incompatibilities. For example, when pre-Christian Oriental origins conflicted with notions of Gnostic heresy as a late development. Its relation to other fields also varied, at times deeply entangled with philology and Enlightenment historiography, at other times allied with forms and statements of theology, existential philosophy, phenomenology, and comparative religions. Its enunciative modes have also shifted dramatically, bearing our theme, Gnosticism, back and forth between the forms of church and university. While this theme remains nominally the same, It became lodged in different types of discourse, where it took on different functions, participated in a variety of strategies, and moved among distinct sets of power relations. Yet the function of this discourse has remained unchanged, to represent the other. The study of Gnosticism is thus imbricated in intellectual discourses and power relations that extend far beyond any notion of disinterested objectivity, and often far beyond the explicit intentions of individual scholars. The challenge before us is to propose a new framework for the study of religion and antiquity, religion in antiquity, by rethinking the methodologies and theoretical foundations of historiography as they are implied in the study of Gnosticism. What I am suggesting is not so radical as some may fear or others may hope. The basic methods of historiography remain fundamental to the task at hand, but I want to deploy them toward different ends and emphases, and that will require some theoretical reassessments, especially with regard to methods of approach and sociological assumptions. Rethinking methodology. The ancient discourse of orthodoxy and heresy has affected not only the goals and substance of the study of Gnosticism, but its methods as well. I suggest that in the development of modern historical scholarship, the concerns of ancient discourse with origins, essence, and purity were transformed into disciplinary methodologies. The search for origins was taken over by historicism. The delineation of purity and contamination became lodged in the terminology and methodologies of anti-syncretism, and the determination of essence was grounded in phenomenological methods of typology and existential philosophy. Genealogy, as the historical enterprise of tracing a phenomenon from its origins through its varied developments, intersected all three. I have suggested for disentangling historical methods from this apparatus. First, as Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, uh, I think that's how you pronounce it, has argued, historians must scrutinize their goals in order to make historiography's ethical character apparent and the subject to critique. Though historiography will always be involved in power relations, some relations need not operate under clandestine cover. Second, historiography can do its work better once it has been disentangled from a focus on origins, purity, and essence. None of these has a legitimate place in historical research, given that historical phenomena never have a pure origin but are always in media res, given that there is no purity, only mixtures, no essence, only continuity of difference. To illustrate further, I will take up each method in turn and then discuss how it might be approached differently. Historical investigation and the search for origins. The goal of historical methods in Gnosticism studies has often been to get at the original phenomenon itself, shorn of historical accretions and errors. Too often, determining the site and impulse of this primal origin has seemed to be sufficient for describing the true nature of Gnosticism, without further need for interpretation or explanation. Textual criticism, for example, has proceeded by analyzing the textual variants in existing manuscripts in order to produce a critical edition whose goal is to establish the original text, quote unquote, as so far as possible. This goal has frequently led scholars to treat all variants except one as secondary corruptions of the authentic original work. Transmission history has often been pressed into the service of textual criticism, functioning to locate and eliminate textual corruptions, whether inadvertent or intentional. The goal is to discern and remove all traces of the theological or sociological interests, tendencies, quote unquote, of later traditors, with the result of that copyists, editors, and interpreters are all treated as corruptors, quote unquote, of the original work. In this scenario, the interests of traditors become motives for corruption, not evidence of practice. Specialists are now recognizing these methods, especially by exploring the performative and hermeneutical aspects of textuality and transmission. Similarly, source criticism had worked to identify the origin of Gnosticism by dismantling a work into its source, quote unquote, components, seen either as independent literary works or as intellectual influences, quote unquote. Those component sources were aligned with normative traditions such as Judaism or Platonism, themselves operating within the parameters of Christian identity discourse. That is, a source was identified and then said to be properly Jewish, like Genesis, or philosophical, like Plato's Timaeus. Scholars arranged them hierarchically, either typologically in terms of their foundational importance to the myth, or chronologically in terms of a hypothetical history of composition. So, for example, one might claim that the Jewish sources of the Apocryphon of John are primary, the Platonizing elements secondary. Finally, they ascribed the origin of Gnosticism to the site of the most primary source materials, for example, Judaism. The last move requires a logical leap of Olympic proportions. If the most logically primary or chronologically early source of materials of Gnostic works are shown to be Jewish, then the origin of Gnosticism is said to lie in Judaism. Well, that certainly is a leap for sure. The same is true for Platonism or Iranian myth or some other authentic religious tradition. The generation of a literary work and its provenance cannot, however, be ascertained in this way for several reasons. The first is that the component sources themselves are insufficient to account for the resulting phenomenon. It is the generation of the whole that has to be accounted for. Second, literary works, let alone intellectual influences, quote unquote, can belong, quote unquote, to and move among heterogeneous social groups, as did scripture and Platonic writings among Jews, Christians, and Greek philosophers. So knowing who originally, quote unquote, produced a particular literary work is not a sure indication of who is using it as a source, quote unquote, for a later work. Finally, the fact that the literary works of Valentinian myth or Sethian Gnosticism evince heterogeneous source materials itself blurs the lines between the normative traditions to which such sources are aligned. Using factors such as misinterpretation of scripture, impiety or rebellion, historical crisis, or existential alienation to account for the introduction of difference into stable and well-bounded spheres is a desperate course of action. Source criticism can help determine the resources authors employed in myth-making, but this method will not lead to the origin of Gnosticism. Syncretism as impurity and inauthenticity. Source criticism has served not only the quest for origins but also the rhetoric of purity. In the case of Gnosticism, the practice of assigning each source to its true normative tradition has led to the conclusion that, quote, Gnosticism has no tradition of its own, but only a borrowed one, end quote, as Rudolph puts it. Quote, a further peculiarity of the Gnostic tradition lies in the fact that it frequently draws its materials from the most varied existing traditions, attaches itself to it, and at the same time sets it in a new frame by which this material takes on a new character and a completely new significance. Seen from the outside, the Gnostic documents are often compositions and even compilations from the mythological or religious ideas of the most varied regions of religion and culture, from Greek, Jewish, Iranian, Christian, in Manichaeism, also Indian and the Far East. To this extent, Gnosis, as has already been repeatedly established, is a product of Hellenistic syncretism, that it is the mingling of Greek and Oriental traditions and ideas subsequent to the conquests of Alexander the Great. Yet the expression Kunstmythen, quote unquote, probably butchering that word, for the Gnostic systems is misleading and should for preference be avoided. It is not at all a case of artificial, quote unquote, and fundamentally unimportant compilations, but of illustrations of existential situations of the Gnostic view of the world. Since this view of the world attaches itself in the main to the older religious imagery, almost as a parasite prospers on the soil of host religion, quote unquote, it can be almost described as parasitic. To this extent, Gnosticism, strictly speaking, has no tradition of its own, but only a borrowed one. Its mythology is a tradition consciously created from alien material, which it has appropriated to match its own basic conception. End quote. Here, the charge of syncretism functions to show not only the impurity of Gnostic tradition, but also to evaluate it negatively. If it cannot properly be called Kunstmythen, artificial myth, it should at least be called parasitic, quote unquote. A rare point of universal agreement in Gnostic studies is that Gnosticism is syncretic. Syncretism, as it is said, is one clear factor that differentiates Christianity from Gnosticism. The essence of Christianity is described as original and authentic, while Gnosticism is said to be derivative, artificial, and parasitic. As Rudolph said above, it has no tradition of its own, but simply borrowed from others. Christianity, by contrast, is said to be original and to have developed naturally, quote unquote, out of Judaism. There's got to be some irony in this somewhere. I'm sorry. Yet the comparative study of religion has made it clear that all religions are syncretic. That is to say, they are subject to processes of quote amalgamation, of blending heterogeneous beliefs and practices, end quote. Syncretism is, quote, an aspect of religious interaction over time, end quote. It is about change, about the dynamics of religious beliefs and practices through time and across geographical and cultural space. There is no question that Gnostic materials are syncretistic in this sense, but the same can, of course, be said of Christianity. Exactly. Since all religions are both syncretic and unique, it is redundant to characterize any tradition in these terms. How then are we to understand the claim that as a syncretic religion, Gnosticism is derivative while Christianity is original. As discussed in Chapter 2, the term syncretism, quote unquote, not only denotes historical processes of amalgamation, but also contains implicit rhetorical evaluations of those processes. As Peter van de Veer writes, quote, the term syncretism, quote unquote, refers to a politics of difference and identity, and as such, the notion of power is crucial in its understanding. The at stake is the power of to identity. Uh, Let's start over here. At stake is the power to identify true religion and to authorize some practices as truthful, quote unquote, and others as false, quote unquote. Syncretism is regarded positively by some as promoting tolerance and negatively by others as promoting the decline of the pure faith. Syncretism is a term within that discourse of identity which acknowledges the permeability and fluidity of social life, but is used to evaluate it. End quote. Modern discourse about Gnostic syncretism has been thoroughly negative, replicating to a large degree the polemicists' indictments of heresy. Claims that Christianity is original while Gnosticism is derivative have rested on a sociologically untenable distinction between originality as pure and syncretism as mixed. Pitting Gnostic syncretism against some pure essence of Christianity does not merely identify heresy, quote unquote, or Gnosticism, quote unquote, both in the singular, it produces them as the other, quote unquote, of Christianity. Of course, the phenomena meant to be covered by the terms heresy, quote unquote, and Gnosticism, quote unquote, already existed in some sense. That is, Valentinus, Basilides, and others did live in the past. They did write documents and hold ideas that the church fathers opposed, and so on, but they did not exist as heretics or as examples of Gnosticism, quote unquote, until those categories were invented by polemicists or modern scholars to serve specific purposes in their politics of religious identity. The point is that in both ancient and modern writers about heresy and Gnosticism, anti-syncretism serves as a strategic discourse that produces heresy, quote unquote, or Gnosticism, quote unquote, primarily to function in the identity formation, boundary setting, authorization, and defense of an authentic Christianity. Anti-syncretism has been central to these apologetic enterprises. According to Van der Veer, the term syncretism, quote unquote, came into parlance during the Reformation, almost solely in the context of intra-Christian controversy. It was developed largely by Protestants as a rhetorical tool to discredit Catholicism by charging Catholics with corrupting the original truth of Christianity through the incorporation of pagan, idolatrous elements. Well, that's a hoot. That's definitely a hoot. Simultaneously, the discourse served to buttress Protestants' own claims to represent a return to pristine Christian origins. Anti-syncretistic discourse clearly functioned here in the defense of religious boundaries and in the construction of authenticity, quote unquote, and purity, quote unquote. It is no coincidence that the term Gnosticism, quote unquote, was also coined in this same period and in the same anti-Catholic context. The identification of Catholicism with Gnosticism and both of them with idolatrous heresy reinscribes the anti-syncretistic discourse of the polemicists within the Reformation context. Numerous variations of anti-syncretistic discourse appeared in 19th and 20th century historiography as well, where they have exerted considerable influence. Phenomenology and the determination of essence. Typological characterizations of Gnosticism, such as that of Hans Jonas, have sought to determine the essence, Wesenbetzimung, I guess, of Gnosticism through the use of phenomenological method. In the study of religion, phenomenology drew on three coalescing streams of thought: the phenomenological movement in philosophy, comparative studies and history of religions, and existentialism. Philosophical phenomenology aimed at providing a philosophical basis for making truth statements about phenomena. In practice, this method called for the suspension of judgment, epoch, uh, probably not, something else probably, in order to attend to phenomena as they appeared, describing rather than explaining them and equalizing each aspect. The goal was to focus on a phenomenon in order to determine its structural or variant and invariant features so as finally to identify the directional shape, quote unquote, of the experience that generated and was generated by the phenomenon. Comparative religions use typology to analyze traditional religious categories and their symbolic structures. The goal was to arrange groups of religious phenomena such as sacrifice and asceticism so that the essentials of the phenomena themselves could emerge and be understood without recourse to dogmatic presuppositions. Impulses from existential philosophy also came into play, especially where the goal was to unveil the deep structures and meanings concealed within the life world of religious experience. Jonas's use of phenomenological method in his development of a Gnostic typology drew on each of these. The irony, however, is that in the end, Jonas came to much the same conclusions as the polemicists had offered, with the addition that Gnosticism could now be seen as a religion of alienation and revolt, with features similar to that of 20th century nihilism. Yeah, I can see that. Phenomenological method has been criticized for its claims to purely objective and presuppositionalist analysis. That's a mouthful. Presuppositionalist. No, I said it wrong. Presuppositionless analysis. Yeah, that's correct. More important for historiography, the historical character of a phenomenon is lost when it is defined in terms of abstracted essences. Phenomenology eschews the messy, fragmentary, uh, particularistic, and relativizing character of historical methods in favor of analytic purity, in which all presuppositions are suspended and all historical contingency, all politics, all social particularities drop away like tissue and reveal the thing in itself, quote unquote. Needless to say, in practice, the thing itself is a product of its own production, reproducing its producer's positionality, particularity, and contingency. It, it reveals some things and hides others. It serves some purposes and defies others. While phenomenology laudably intended to lead to an appreciation of religious phenomena, apart from dogmatic judgments or reductionist explanations. In the case of Gnosticism, the method succeeded largely in reinscribing the polemicists' denigrations and in separating the distinctive expressions of Gnosticism from the headset cut off again. Let's back up a little bit. In the case of Gnosticism, the method succeeded largely in reinscribing the polemicists' denigrations and in separating the distinctive expressions of Gnosticism from the social, historical, and political contexts in which they were meaningful. Moreover, by presupposing Gnosticism to be a distinct entity subject to phenomenological analysis, it necessarily rendered Gnosticism as a product of its methodology. It was in the hands of phenomenology that Gnosticism came to be most thoroughly reified as a distinct entity in its own right. Yet, as I have argued above, the variety of phenomena classified as Gnostic, quote unquote, simply will not support a single monolithic definition, and in fact, none of the primary materials fits the standard typological definition. Of course, part of the reason for this seemingly astonishing fact is that the defining characteristics themselves are distorting. But another crucial reason is that typological lists are, by definition, synthetic products. Such lists are culled from a wide variety of materials and therefore do not necessarily describe any of them in particular. The same is true for characterizations of, quote, the Gnostic myth, end quote. It, too, is a synthetic product that the history of religions scholars assembled from widely disparate materials in Mandaean and Manichaean, Persian, and heresiological sources. Although it was produced to consolidate the essential elements held in common by these disparate materials, it in fact succeeded only in giving the false impression that a monolithic Gnostic myth spread across a wide geographical and culturally heterogeneous area. Because none of the texts contains all the listed characteristics, typological phenomenology raises the question of how many elements of the ideal type any particular case has to events in order to qualify as an example of Gnosticism. Some scholars emphasize a single characteristic as determinative, such as anti-cosmic dualism, consubstantiality of the human with divine, or salvation by knowledge through a particularly popular choice has been the distinction between the true God and the creator God of Genesis. Others list a set of characteristics whose combination signals a phenomenon to be Gnostic. This method has also given rise to unfortunate compromise terms like, quote, proto-Gnosticism, end quote, pre-Gnosticism, quote unquote, and Gnostoid, quote unquote. I haven't heard that one before. That's a goofy one. To refer to phenomena that contain some, but not all, or at least not enough of, the necessary characteristics to deserve the unreserved designation. Such terms serve to illustrate how blurry this definitional method is and how imprecise its results. The synthetic character of typological definitions also works to project a false and artificial uniformity onto what are quite varied phenomena. By erasing or at least submerging the differences among Gnostic phenomena, typology hides the problem of variety rather than solves it. Some of these problems are inherent in the methodology of typological delimitation itself. apart from the distortions of identity politics and the multiformity of the various materials. It would seem, for example, that typology functions to simplify phenomena by reducing them to their most basic characteristics. Inherent in this process, however, are the dangers of oversimplification and stereotyping. Misrepresentation easily can occur when such syntheses become mere shorthand denotations or reifications bearing little resemblance to the materials from which they were supposedly derived. The attempt to overcome problems of variety and lack of sociological information by bracketing, quote unquote, them works not to clarify, but to obscure the phenomena they are designed to describe. Further, it is easy to appreciate the charge that the selectivity involved in typological delimitation is arbitrary and hides the operations of an unarticulated agenda. Selecting particular aspects of a phenomenon as primary makes them dominant and regulates other aspects to marginality or invisibility. With the Apocryphon of John, for example, dualism and impious interpretation of Scripture so predominate the standard readings that its utopian theology or techniques for physical healing are slighted or missed altogether. What criteria are employed to distinguish the essential from the incidental features of a phenomenon, and who decides what they will be? Some criteria must underlie these decisions, but too often their purposes are not articulated and therefore cannot be critically scrutinized for adequacy. Many typological definitions of Gnosticism, for example, are based on an unarticulated but implicit comparison with normative constructions of Christianity and Judaism, or some more vague notion of, quote, true religion, end quote. In the end, the most important problems arising from typological method have less to do with the improper application of the method than with its ahistoricizing, essentializing, and homogenizing effects. Yeah. Trying to fine tune application will not resolve these difficulties. These means not that we should dispense with typologies altogether, but rather that their purposes and positionalities need to be clearly articulated and then provisionality recognized. For example, Schenke's list of Sethian characteristics has been extremely helpful in moving the analysis of these materials forward. It would be misleading, however, to lose sight of the intellectual status of the resultant construction, Sethian Gnosticism, quote unquote, as a typological construct. Rethinking history. The most intractable problems in Gnostic studies, the disputes over the origins of Gnosticism, the inadequacy of syncretism to model cultural change and interaction, and the untenability of typological characteristics, are tied to methods concerned with determining origins, purity, and essence. I am not suggesting that the disciplinary methods of historical inquiry are be jettisoned, far from it, but they must be reoriented toward different ends and complemented by new forms of analysis. What I am calling for is a shift in historical, critical, and literary methods away from the search for origins to the analysis of practice. We in here talking about practice. Not a game, not a game. We're talking about practice. Initially, this rethinking means that certain inherited assumptions need be abandoned. need to be abandoned. Chief among them are the following. Pause. The association between truth and chronology. The ancient polemicists and apologists held that truth is chronologically prior to error. We see this presupposition still at work in the resistance to Bauer's thesis that in some places heresy, quote unquote, might have arisen earlier than orthodoxy, quote unquote, and it is inscribed even more consistently in battles over dating the composition of early Christian sources. Those who wish to support normative claims for the New Testament argue for the early dating of these and other Orthodox quote unquote works, while simultaneously resisting attempts to date non canonical, especially heretical quote unquote works early. Those who argue for relatively early dates for non-canonical or heretical quote unquote materials understand full well what is at stake and often intend to undermine the authority of orthodoxy quote unquote through the dating game. We see that all the time, don't we? For either side. I'm I mean I mean there was a time when merely calling a work Gnostic, quote unquote, assumed a late date, mid to late second century at the earliest, but this assumption can no longer be sustained. It is becoming increasingly clear that the early Jesus tradition generated a variety of responses, not all of which would later become orthodox, quote unquote. The history of religions school has posited a pre-Christian origin for Gnosticism, but despite this apparently radical claim, it retains the assumption that truth has a chronological dimension, demonstrated by charting phenomena from their primitive origins to their full development. But neither model is acceptable. Chronology in and of itself neither guarantees nor refutes theological truth or superiority, because that would be genetic fallacy, would it not? The notion that truth is pure, mixing is contamination. This assumption is thoroughly embedded in the anti-syncretistic discourse of both ancient polemics and modern scholarship. Historical phenomena do not, however, admit of purity in the sense that they have no precedence, or that they are unique in ways that other phenomena are not. All religions are syncretistic. All are unique in that no historical phenomena is fully identical to any other. Purity and contamination are therefore not amenable to historical analysis. They belong instead to social dash rhetorical claims that groups make in constructing their collective identity and setting boundaries for continuity and change that are for continuity and change that are acceptable to them. The assumption that truth, orthodoxy, quote unquote, is characterized by unity, uniformity, and unanimity. Falsehood, heresy, quote unquote, by division, multiformity, and diversity. History cannot support this assertion. Orthodox, quote unquote, Christianity itself is diverse and multiform and repeatedly racked by division. So too with other religious traditions. Difference is not necessarily in itself a problem. Indeed, differences are constructive and constituent of reality. End quote. 27. An alternative approach is to reconceive religious tradition and identity in forms of continuity in difference. In two different words, in difference, not one word. It's easily I mean, this is you can see this on the page because I have it. I'm recording this, but if this was just an audio, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. No pun intended, I guess. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. This perspective assumes that there is no such thing as pure beginnings. As George Eliot puts it so eloquently, quote, no retrospect will take us to the true beginning, and whether our prologue be in heaven or on earth, it is but a fraction of that all presupposing fact with which our story sets out, end quote. History is not a tableau vivant, quote unquote, of static essences, but a drama of change and movement. The movement in the flow of events that we fix upon as, quote, the beginning, quote unquote, end quote, does not reveal essence in any epistemologically privileged way. It too, like all that follows, is always in medias res. It's Latin for something. Uh, in flux, maybe? I don't know. Throughout this book, I have tried to show that religions are not fixed entities with a determinate essence or divisive moment of pure origination. They are constructions that require assiduous, ongoing labor to maintain in the face of both contested power relations within and porous overlapping boundaries with traditions without. Relations among such traditions therefore cannot properly be conceived as stable or neat. As Virginia Burroughs puts it so aptly, quote, Christianity and Gnosticism, and for that matter, Judaism, are neighboring, indeed overlapping, and repeatedly cross fertilizing, hybrid, multifarious, ever shifting, co emergent discourses participating in a broader Hellenistic quote unquote field of cultural hybridity. Thus, none of them can be used to anchor or encompass definitionally, far less originate, quote unquote, the other, end quote. From this perspective, it is simply inaccurate to say that Gnosticism arose from Judaism or Christianity or Hellenic philosophy, or even that Christianity arose from Judaism. Rather, such religious designations or genetic claims have to be analyzed for their rhetorical ends and multifarious effects. Con- Continuity in difference affirms that tradition and identity are not pure and fixed, but constantly in process of formation, deformation, and reformation, if they are alive. Indeed, as Cornell West puts it, quote, tradition is not just a given, it is fought for, end quote. A tradition is never the whole story of identity. It is only a part of the mix. As Homi Baba writes, quote, in restaging the past, it introduces other incommensurable cultural temporalities into the invention of tradition. And this process estranges any immediate access to an ordinary originary identity or a quote received end quote tradition end quote. Continuity in difference implies a process of cultural change in which breaking and joining occur simultaneously, in which quote the terms of cultural engagement, whether antagonistic or affiliative, are produced performatively, end quote. It eschews the identity politics of anti-syncretistic rhetoric by refusing to assume, construct, or reify essentialist categories of religious identity. Hybridity, not purity, characterizes historical processes. Every religious tradition contains the plural possibilities of its past, present, and present circumstances. Recent views assume that, quote, boundedness, continuity, and homogeneity rather, are not objective aspects of social life, end quote, but rather rhetorical terms that construct particular ways of talking about and understanding the identity of a religious community. Social groups are constantly engaged in identity formation and boundary setting, using the available resources to think with. To understand these processes, it is critical to shift the perspective away from understanding, quote, religions as ready-made systems of meaning awaiting interpretation, end quote, as Ortner puts it, to the view that, quote, people are spinning what Geertz called webs of meaning, quote unquote, all the time with whatever cultural resources happen to be at hand, end quote. As Ortner sees it, the fundamental assumption we need to work with is that, quote, the people are always trying to make sense of their lives, always weaving fabrics of meaning, however fragile and fragmentary, end quote. Viewed this way, the study of ancient cultural hybridity should focus less on identifying which materials are combined in syncretic amalgamation than on the discourses, processes, and practices by which people make sense of their lives in contexts of ancient pluralism, the governing regimes and institutions that further and constrain such practices, and the power relations that are at stake. The task of history, then, is to analyze these processes, not to identify the true quote unquote provenance of particular ideas, stories, and practices, nor designate who, quote, authentically, end quote, owns them. Rather, historians have to ask who makes such claims, upon what are they based, and what purposes they serve. It is precisely these kinds of questions that are under contention, for example, in the ancient arguments over the correct interpretation of Scripture. To whom does Scripture really belong? Who can interpret it correctly? The pertinent historical question is not whether a tradition is pure or not, or who really owns it, but what are the resources being used to think with, whether literary or non-literary texts, quote unquote, cultural codes, or discursive structures. What hermeneutical strategies are at work? What are the generative, rhetorically constructed problems being addressed, and to what ends are they employed? Orienting an analysts toward practice rather than origins significantly shifts the functions of historical critical and literary methods. Textual criticism focuses on the understanding of textuality itself, including a work's own account of its production. Variants are analyzed for clues to the shifting meaning of and uses of the work throughout its transmission history. So, too, such factors as translation from Greek to Coptic, variations in scribal hand, dialect, codicological construction, the grouping of specific works in particular codices, and even the jar in which they were buried. Transmission history needs to be written in two directions. For example, with Nag Hammadi, backward from the discovery of the jar toward reconstructing its increasingly hypothetical states of use and production, and forward from the rediscovery in 1945 towards its meanings and uses in contemporary contexts. Analysis of genre, structure, literary strategies, and themes would be used to identify a work's generative problematics and hermeneutical strategies. Source criticism needs to shift from identifying precedents to analyzing the hermeneutical logic of the work. Instead of deconstructing a work into its subunits or determining the background, quote unquote, of the influences, quote unquote, exerted on it. The task of source criticism is to determine what resources are being used to think with and what hermeneutical strategies of intertextual reading are being employed to shape a work's meaning and rhetorical argument. Comparison with other works using shared resources such as Philo and Apocryphon of John's readings of Plato's Timaeus or Genesis would elucidate how such strategies and arguments operate. The difference between the anti-syncretistic approach of source criticism and intertextuality lies in how we conceive of the practices of textual production. Genealogical approaches, aided by the notion of syncretism, quote unquote, assume that authors borrow or are influenced by ideas and literary sources created by others. The original ideas and literary sources are usually ascribed some fixed and essential meaning, often figured as the intention of the original author, which is distorted by appropriation into the new context. Analysis is concerned with determining how much the new author slash redactor has created and how much he or she has borrowed. Source criticism is employed to determine those parameters. Intertextuality, by contrast, focuses on the reader. It eschews notions of essence and instead insists that texts are always replete with alternative meanings because they are characterized by gaps, incongruity, and polyphony. Polyphony? Something like that. I want to go with polyphony. That sounds correct. Uh, no composition is ever an act of pure creativity, quote unquote, in that all texts contain citation of earlier discourses, and because cultural codes constrain as well as enable literary production. Intertextuality focuses on the transformation of meaning rather than the the genealogy of appropriation. The issue then is not to determine what is creatively new or original, but to understand the literary practices, cultural codes, discursive structures, hermeneutical strategies, and rhetorical ends that constrain and make possible the production of a particular literary work. Similarly, rhetorical criticism is not limited to identifying the literary modes of persuasion taught in the ancient school tradition, though that would remain an important task. Rhetorical analysis instead seeks to identify a work's construction of the implied author and audience. It tends as well as it means of it its ends as well as its means of persuasion, the issues under contention, and the symbolic world it assumes as well as the world it constructs. In this mode, rhetorical criticism is not one method among others, but a strategic intervention in historical epistemology insofar as it cautions against confusing a work's rhetorical construction of its author readers problematics and situation with the actual historical world of its author readers problematics and situation. In short, literary works are not mirrored reflections of reality, but interventions aimed at achieving specific effects. Such aims, of course, are never solely those consciously intended by the author. Rather, they are shaped by the world, quote unquote, as reservoir of signs, as fields of action, as networks of power, as constructions of symbolic universes. End quote. Oh, I didn't realize that was a quote. World as reservoir of signs, as fields of action, as networks of power, and as constructions of symbolic universes, end quote. Rhetorical analysis helps us get at the dynamic interrelationship between textual inscription and the world of symbols, power relations, and action. I mean, semiotics has entered the chat to some extent. As readers, audiences, and contexts shift over time, so will the rhetorical effects of the work. Insofar as possible, we need to know what the shifting intertexts are, not simply the literary resources of the work itself, but the world as a resource of signs, and what the and what the social political contexts are in order to see what work they are doing and for whom. For example, the works contained in the Nag Hammadi codices had meanings and functions in their compositional contexts that were different from those they had for the Pacomian monks who collected and hid them, or for the polemicists who wrote against them, and yet again different from the meanings and functions they serve in the hands of their 20th century interpreters. This kind of analysis should help us get at those and other meanings and functions of these works. Time in history. Such a historical methodology would have definite repercussions for writing the history of Christianity. We would have to abandon those two most pervasive narrative structures for telling the story of Christian origins, the plot of pure origin and subsequent decline, and the plot of progress from primitive state to progressive development. It would no longer be possible to divide the phenomena into two and only two types, orthodoxy rather, and heresy, which is heterodoxy. Maybe a Freudian slip in there somewhere. Nor into linear trajectories of diverse forms of Christianity, nor into a set of coherent and internally consistent, but mutually exclusive and antagonistic varieties of Christianities, quote unquote, however diverse. In each case, the coherence of the phenomenon established by these approaches is the effect of scholarly discourses, not the practices of first to fourth century writers and readers. Only a few plots remain available to us. Constrained as we are by our own cultural codes, and not least by our notion of time. The new physics, from relativity to subatomic particle studies, is in the process of reconceptualizing the Western construction of time. In quantum physics, the relationship between events is a consequence of measurement. The causal relation between two events is not perceptible except as a gap. Although I cannot claim to understand this research in any detail, it is clear that time can no longer be plotted in terms of the relation of parts to the whole as a set of causal links, unifying past and present in a direct linear scheme. This perspective suggests that we must begin instead with the whole, but the whole is not readily apparent. Now it is far from clear that the events of history follow the laws of physics, but there would nonetheless seem to be certain conceptual similarities between science and the philosophy of history. Ricoeur, for example, probably butchered his name too, speaks of the the unrepresentability of time, end quote, in narrative. In the conclusion to his massive 3-volume work on time and narrative, he writes that, quote, man, this is kind of a spoiler alert. He writes that, quote, the confession of the limits of narrative correlative to the confession of the mystery of time gives rise to the exigence to think more and to speak differently, end quote. This confession is no warrant for obscurantism. We must maintain, he argues, quote, that the reaffirmation of the historical consciousness, the historical consciousness within the limits of its validity requires in turn the search by individuals and by the communities to which they belong for their respective narrative identities, end quote. Foucault, by contrast, argues, quote, The historical sense gives rise to three uses that oppose and correspond to the three Platonic modalities of history. The first is parodic, uh, directed against reality, and opposes the theme of history as reminiscence or recognition. The second is dissociative, directed against identity, and opposes history given as continuity or representative of a tradition. The third is sacrificial, directed against truth, and opposes history as knowledge. They imply a use of history that severs its connection to memory, its metaphysical and anthropological model, and constructs a counter memory, a transformation of history into a totally different form of time. End quote. This new form of time is discontinuous and unpatterned. It is not serious, real, or true. It provides no orientation for values, meanings, or identity. It produces no positive definition, no absolutes. It rejects the notion that meaning can be found in the return to origins, in the apocalyptic culmination of time, or in history itself, as in salvation theology. History is not about truth, but about power relations of domination. Where does this philosophical analysis leave narratives of Christian origins? It suggests that no narrative can offer an adequate representation of the past as an objective or objectified entity, that a genealogical history of Foucault's sort will display the workings of discourse, charting gaps, incongruities, discontinuities, and transformations, and therefore cease to connect events causally or attempt to show that events follow any pattern leading to inevitable outcomes. The challenge will be to understand the parts by first grappling with the unfathomable whole, and yet at the same time to see events in terms of the episodic operations of discourses and understand identity formations as the discontinuous and incongruent deployments of the strategies and themes of shifting power relations. Yet I believe that Ricoeur is also right. The poetics of narrative will not cease to struggle against the aporetics of time. I don't know if I said that word right. Aporetics. Individuals and communities will continue to represent truth, meaning, and identity in narrative, but a correlative recognition of the quote unrepresentability of time end quote means that we must quote think more and speak differently end quote. Above all, that means that the ethics of identity construction, cognizant of the power relations in such enterprises, must come to the fore. How then should we speak differently? How might we represent the history of Christianity, and to what ends? For whom should this history be written? What story of truth and identity ought to tell it? In answering these questions, I can offer only partial perspectives of some of the principles such a task would assume. The analysis I propose here aims to get at practice rather than at origins and essence. It offers no larger connected totality, but rather a set of episodes no longer linked in any causal linear frame of origins and development. The results of this historiographical method would be to demonstrate where and how the textual quote unquote resources, cultural codes, literary themes, hermeneutical strategies, social political situations, and religious interests of various rhetorical acts of Christian literary production, theological reflection, ritual and ethical practices, and social construction simultaneously form multiple overlapping continuities, disjunctures, contradictions, and discontinuities. Such historiographical enterprises will result in more than number two. Starting over, such historiographical enterprises will result in more than one true and authentic narrative, but not in a narrative of Christian triumph or a naturalization of the development of orthodoxy, since they would chart the decisive acts that construct orthodoxy, quote unquote, through rhetorical political acts of erasure, harmonization, and fiat within the complex of Christian practices in the Mediterranean world. They would note throughout what was at they would note throughout what was at stake and for whom. These 21st century historical practices would without doubt result in more than one possible legitimate narrative of Christianity, based as they would be not only in the different perspectives of scholars and the communities to which they are accountable, but also in different ethical orientations. Discussion of Christian identity, theology, spirituality, and practice would constructively and critically engage this enriched and complexified set of historical portraits. This book by no means offers a complete analysis of the 20th century study of Gnosticism. Its aim was more limited, to locate some of the incongruities in the construction of Gnosticism in order to aid in, quote, thinking hard and speaking differently, end quote, about religious identity formation. I have suggested that to think hard and speak differently require revising our notions of tradition and history, reshaping discourse, categories, and methods, and above all, rethinking the ethically informed goals of historical analysis. And that is the end of chapter 8 and the end of the main part of the book. Should read the notes on methodology. Let's see how far. Where are we? Yeah, we can probably read this because methodology is important, as the book has labored the point over and over, I believe. Notes on methodology. Taking up the question of how to define Gnosticism has been a part of my own effort to make sense of the frameworks, methods, goals, and uses of historical study and interpretation of texts. My perspectives about writing history have been informed by a set of larger questions being debated in the academy concerning the polyvalence of symbols, the multiformity of religious traditions, cultural hybridity, language and representation, the ontological and epistemological bases for historiography, Orientalism, race, gender, and post-colonial politics. Oh, work in feminism, rhetorical criticism, sociology, anthropology, philosophy of history, new historicism, postmodern philosophy. There we go. Now we're getting warmer. That's what I thought. And postcolonialism has led me to reshape the project in significant ways, for sure. On the surface, this project appears to be constructed as a history of ideas, but it attempts to move beyond the limitations of that enterprise. The book is framed not in terms of a description of previous historical practice in the study of Gnosticism, but in terms of an analysis and critique of discourse, in particular, the discourse of orthodoxy and heresy. The notion of discourse at work here is primarily influenced by Foucault, Rutrow, for whom the analysis of discourse focuses not on grammatical, logical, or psychological links among groups of verbal performances, but on links among statements. Statements include a principle of differentiation, for example, between orthodoxy and heresy, prescribe the position of subjects who speak, for example, as apostolic defender of the faith or as deviant innovator, articulate as associated field, not the real context or historical situation of a verbal performance, but, for example, the coexistence of philosophical truth or religious piety with orthodoxy, and define the status and possibilities for using and reusing elements of a strategy, such as claiming that a statement is eternal revelation from God, in institutionalizing such claims in canon and creed, doctrines of apostolic succession, and ecclesiastical authority. Discourse of orthodoxy and heresy produces and organizes the practices of normative Christian identity formation and the institutions which they operate, such that certain ways of speaking, in terms of the concept of Gnosticism, its origin and development in relation to true Christianity, its essential characteristics, and so forth, differentiate and construct literary remains as, quote, evidence of Gnosticism, end quote, so as to constitute a mode of knowledge about religious truth and falsehood. This discourse both enables and constrains how claims about the way the world is, about proper social relations among persons and groups, and about appropriate ethical values and orientations can be made and contested. The discourse of orthodoxy and heresy, like all discourses, contain within it gaps, incongruities, discontinuities, and disjunctions that allow for transformations, substitutions, and entanglements with other fields and discursive formations, notably Enlightenment philosophy, historicism, and Orientalism. I have found it helpful to read Foucault's notion of discourse in terms of the sociological framework offered by Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu's work helps me better understand the dynamics of discursive formations as practices within the operations of social construction and the power relations they establish and constrain. His notion of habitus is crucial here. Quote, the conditionings associated with a particular class of conditions of existence produce habitus. Habitus? Habitus. Systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures, predisposed to function as structuring structures. What in the world? Use your words, mate. Did I just get exhibited? We got structured structures in your structure, so you can structured structures while you're structuring. I don't know. That is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an expressed mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them. Well, I guess that's that. Structured structures. Predisposed to function as structuring structures means. Objectively regulated, quote unquote, and regular, quote unquote, without being in any way the product of obedience to rules. They can be collectively orchestrated without being the product of the organizing action of a conductor. I think that's the end of the quote. Uh, yeah. Discourse analysis, it seems to me, provides a method to understand the processes of the regulated practices of habitus in operation. Bourdieu's work is more useful than Foucault's in understanding the practical aims and effects of discursive formations in the material and social world. Bourdieu emphasizes not only the regularity of practice, but also its improvisational character, and rhetorical logic. Moreover, Bourdieu's social theory allows for a framework that rejects both essentializing and functionalist approaches to the study of religion. Although I do talk about the work that Gnostic myth does, my framework is not functionalism, but Bourdieu's theory of practice. This perspective avoids essentialism in that religious expressions such as myth are understood to be socially constructed. It avoids a purely functionalist approach in that the construction of myth is understood with with the dynamics of Bourdieu's concept of habitus. Habitus? I'm just going to go with habitus. Practice is always about power relations, insofar as practices both produce and reproduce a social group's understanding of the way things are. That understanding rationalizes certain social relations and power dynamics while simultaneously establishing the framework for contesting them. Human practices are always directed toward some purpose. They are always involved in the processes of meaning making, and they always reinscribe, or contest certain relations of power. The practices of meaning making are always involved in constructing, deconstructing, and reconstructing the structures of habitus, in reinscribing and contesting the power relations of the divisions of the social order. Yet consciousness of what one is doing is always limited by the constraints of habitus, by one's acceptance of the way things are, inscribed already on the human body itself through social inculcation. This approach allows us to affirm with essentialists that religion has a basis in social and material reality, a reality that is by no means entirely arbitrary. It also allows us to affirm with functionalists that religious practices are directed toward and achieve certain ends, at once deliberate insofar as authors are have particulars goals. Is that a typo? Particulars goals Particular goals of persuading particular audiences with particular ends, and unconscious insofar as they necessarily reproduce the structures of the habitus and the discourses of the division of the social order. In this sense, the rhetorical argument always exceeds the intention of the authors and readers. It further allows us to affirm the intellectual, ethical, and spiritual value of practice as a fundamental activity of human meaning making and belonging. In no case, however, does this approach allow us to condense religion into a transcendent and materialist essence, nor to dismiss it as simply a social and psychological function. In order to analyze the discourse of orthodoxy and heresy, we can conceptualize religion in terms of field, a site of struggle with its own goals, strategies, and institutions, as well as its own ideological-theoretical frameworks in which certain kinds of practices are rationalized and contested. Struggles within the religious field in question can be analyzed to determine the discourses with which the field operates, the practices it generates, as well as whose interests and what ends it serves. This approach is helpful in gaining a more general comprehension of the dynamics of orthodoxy and heresy. As Bourdieu notes, quote, practical taxonomies, which are transformed, misrecognizable forms of the real divisions of the social order, contribute to the production of that order by producing ob- objectively orchestrated practices adjusted to those divisions, end quote. Thus, the taxonomies of orthodoxy and heresy contribute to producing the divisions of the social order of which they are a product in such a way as to establish that arbitrary order as the natural order of things, in Bourdieu's terms, as doxa. When this naturalization succeeds, the social order appears to be self-evident, necessary, and authoritative precisely because it is collectively affirmed as such. The orthodoxy and heresy, or heterodoxy, however, imply, quote, awareness and recognition of the possibility of different or antagonistic beliefs, end quote. Heterodoxy becomes possible, Bourdieu writes, when, quote, the social world loses its character as a natural phenomenon, end quote, owing to some crisis, such as, quote, cultural contact, end quote, changes in material conditions, or political economic crises. It is then that, quote, the question of the natural or conventional character, fuse or nomo, I don't know if I'm pronouncing those words correctly, of social facts can be raised, end quote. Questioning the established order is, however, never complete because the contest between orthodoxy and heresy rests to some degree on a shared field of opinion. Rather, the struggle is over the boundaries of doxa itself, as Bourdieu puts it. Quote, the dominated classes have an interest in pushing back the limits of doxa and exposing the arbitrariness of the taken for granted. The dominant classes have an interest in defending the integrity of doxa, or in short of this, of establishing in its place the necessarily imperfect substitute, orthodoxy. But the manifest censorship imposed by orthodox discourse, the official way of speaking and thinking the world, conceals another more radical censorship, the overt opposition between right, quote unquote, opinion and left or wrong, quote unquote, opinion, which delimits the universe of possible discourse, be it legitimate or illegitimate, euphemistic or blasphemous, masks in its turn the fundamental opposition between the universe of things that can be stated and hence thought and the universe of that which is taken for granted, end quote. In practice, this means that the limits of any critique of doxa are established precisely by the fact that in the struggle over the boundaries of orthodoxy, all parties to the struggle necessarily unconsciously or subconsciously accept a great deal of the doxa of their shared society. Not only the rules of the game, that is, what kinds of arguments or evidence are considered to be valid or persuasive, but even more the underlying structures that make claims to knowledge of the truth possible at all. Bourdieu's model is extremely useful, not just for analyzing the operations of the discourse of orthodoxy and heresy within early Christianity, but also for identifying the strategies Christians employed in struggles with non Christians. Moreover, it works well to describe the goals of my own analysis of Gnosticism in 20th century historiography. I am actually doing what I am critiquing, writing the origins and history of Gnosticism in order to, quote, subvert the game, end quote. Oh, that's interesting. Bourdieu talks about this kind of struggle with regard to the competition between established and avant-garde designers in the field of fashion. Quote, to counter the subversion strategies of the newcomers, the possessors of legitimacy, that's to say, those who are in the dominant position, will always utter the vague and pompous discourse of the ineffable of what, quote, goes without saying, end quote. Like the dominant groups in the field of relations between the classes, they have conservative, defensive strategies which can remain silent, tacit, because these people only have to be what they are in order to be comme il faut, comme il faut. I guess that's Latin, maybe French. By contrast, the left bank's uh, couturiers have strategies that aim to overthrow the very principles of the game, but always in the name of the game, the spirit of the game. Their strategies of returning to the sources consist in turning against the dominant figures the very principles in the name of which they justify their domination. But the precondition for entry to the field is recognition of the values at stake, and therefore recognition of the limits not to be exceeded on pain of being excluded from the game. It follows that the internal struggle can only lead to partial revolutions that can destroy the hierarchy, but not the game itself. Someone who wants to achieve a revolution in the cinema or in painting says, quote, that is not real cinema, quote unquote, or that is not real painting, quote unquote. He pronounces anathemas, but in the name of a pure, more authentic definition of the principles in whose name the dominant dominate. End quote. This guy has some kind of way with words here. Or again, with regard to the sociology of art, quote, specific revolutions which overthrow the power relations within a field are only possible insofar as those who import new dispositions and want to impose new positions, for example, support outside the field in the new audiences who demands they both express and produce, end quote. So too, one way to conceptualize this study is to see it as an attempt to subvert the game of orthodoxy and heresy as it is played out in the academic field of religious studies. 20th century debates over the question of how to define Gnosticism are largely played out within a field whose goal and stakes are very much tied to the politics of Christian identity formation, as well as to the academic practices of hiring, tenure, promotion, and prestige. Those who have much invested in particular normative definitions seek to keep alive the self-evident nature of Gnosticism as a reified entity so that it can continue to play its role as the heretical other, quote unquote, as the work of scholars such as Walter Bauer and Helmut Koster shows. To expose the constructed character of Gnosticism is to effect a revolution, quote unquote, in the field of by putting in doubt the identity of normative Christianity. The identity of any alternative claim depends on its being accepted by new audiences whose interests lie precisely in subverting the game that has dismissed their demands for a hearing as heresy, quote unquote. Yet any revolution, quote unquote, will necessarily be partial precisely because the critique is pronounced, quote, in the name of a pure, more authentic definition of the principles in whose name the dominate, end quote. Excuse me. In short, the enterprises of academic analysis are thoroughly involved in politics, whether acknowledged or not. Insofar as academics and religious adherents alike claim the right to say how the world is, enterprises designed to defend those claims are as much involved in politics as are those designed to contest them. As Bourdieu puts it, quote, the theory of knowledge to impose the principles of the construction of reality, in particular, so a social reality, is a major dimension of political power, end quote. It is in this sense that writing history requires engaging in the politics of current regimes and power relations of knowledge. Although the analysis in this book has historiographical and political dimensions, my purpose is preeminently ethical. In this regard, I have learned a great deal from the work of Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza on the ethics of historiography. She argues that all interpretation has an ethical dimension. Quote, scholarship, current and past, is always produced by and for people with certain experiences, values, and goals. Hence, one must investigate with implicit interests and unarticulated goals of scholarship, its degree of conscious responsibility and its accountability, end quote. In ethics of interpretation, quote, must foster an ethos of critical reflexivity, democratic debate, intellectual, multilingual, and multidisciplinary competence. It takes as its goal publicly accountable scholarship and the responsible production and communication of such scholarship, end quote. The goal, in short, is not to replace scientific objectivity as the criterion of valid scholarship, but to revitalize its it appropriately in order to insist on the ethical dimension of the pursuit of truth. Such an approach does not deny the reality of the phenomena, but only insists that ethical, self-reflexive critique ought to be a necessary part of all historical writing. There are many workable ways of construing reality, that is, of acting consistently with existing material and social conditions, but not all would be equally desirable ethically. Although comprehending historical reconstructions as relative as socially constructed does undermine claims to possess a single objective truth. It does not undermine the capacity for making multiple truth claims or for establishing standards of normativity. The effect is rather to shift the criteria for the adequacy of truth claims away from objectivity to ethics. Ethics will not eschew impartiality in investigating and the disciplined use of historical methods, but will require them. The task at hand is to enable an ethics of critical reflexive practice in historiography and theology. My objective has been not to replace orthodoxy, quote unquote, with heresy, quote unquote, as a new normative foundation, but to rather critical reflexity, but rather to further critical reflexivity, reflexivity with regard to the discourses and methods of historiographical scholarship. Insofar as religious tradition is understood as fixed and given, we can only accept or reject it. But insofar as it is understood as under constant construction and reformation, there is room for human agency and thus human responsibility. This is true even in ideally impartial historical reconstruction. As Bourdieu points out, the objectification of the past is itself part and parcel of our relationship to it. In writing history, we construct not just the past, but our own ethical, social, and political relationship to it. Our own ethical practice is at stake in what we unwittingly may be reproducing elements we consciously abhor, such as, and that's number three, shut down on my headset. Where was I? Such as Christian anti-Judaism or colonialist and racist relations of power. I say unwittingly, quote unquote, because the notions of habitus and doxa fully imply the limits of consciousness and intentionality. It is precisely because of such limits that we must not think it is always safe, quote unquote, to internalize and appropriate religious traditions. Rather, we must explore critically their past and potential implications in violence as well as liberation, in injustice as well as justice. Critical practice necessarily involves accountability. It involves asking to whom one is accountable. Whom do we his, whom do historical reconstructions and theological beliefs and practices serve? Whom do they exclude or harm? The goal is not to destroy tradition, but to open up space for alternative or marginalized voices to be heard within it. A fuller, well, obviously people still take that as being as the goal to destroy tradition, obviously. Oh, you're changing it. I mean, it's an easy claim to make, right? For any tradition, not just Christianity. A fuller historical portrait of religious piety can enrich the funds of religious tradition, providing more complex theological resources to attend to the complex issues of our own day. One's own faith is not diminished by hearing other voices. Exactly. It may even be strengthened and enriched. It just depends on whether one's own faith is militant or not, I suppose, and how they ethically conduct themselves in relation to their faith. Historical study will not be able to provide alternative horizons and visions for human imagination or theological construction, but it can provide an increasingly sound basis for reflection by charting as accurately as possible not just the facts, quote unquote, of the processes of identity formation, but also the historically and socially constructed discourses that produce knowledge, so that the ethical implications of those discourses may be critically considered. Critical historiography can help to overcome ignorance about the ways in which religious traditions and their discourses have been constructed and have functioned in promoting human well being or in furthering violence and injustice. It can provide resources for theological and ethical reflection within communities of faith so that they may engage in constructive critique and reformation of their own traditions, practices, and discourses. From our position of hindsight, it is possible to see that the academic study of Gnosticism has participated in colonialist and pseudoscientific evolutionary discourses of race and culture that have come under considerable criticism in the late 20th century. Ooh-hoo-hoo. Ours is a post-colonial and postmodern world, struggling with the complex legacies of the increasingly pluralistic and multicultural globe we inhabit. It is essential that we gain a critical grasp on these discourses in order to disentangle them from our own work. Yet we do so with respect and appreciation for the contributions of scholars whose work constitutes our own past, knowing that our own enterprises will effect only a partial revolution, and no doubt will be subject to the critical hindsight of those who follow. And that is the end of the notes on methodology. I'm not going to go in the bibliography, obviously, but in closing, I think having actually seeing into the kind of the framework on which she bases her work here, this book, maybe I'm no expert for anything, but it may be a little bit dubious on how she comes about to her. It's not that the ends justify the means. I'm a little bit skeptical about the methodology, but overall, some of the some of the points that she makes are very much valid. I mean, that a lot of the modern day apologetics is based on the polemics of Irenaeus, Tertullian, and such, and I've seen it. I mean, it's that's there's no debating that. Is whether that's correct or not is another story. To correct as in whether you should, whether you ought to base your modern apologetics on such polemics as Irenaeus or Tertullian or Justin Martyr or any number of other church fathers as they are so called. But at the same time, one could push back and say, well, you just want to just you know rework everything because you're in a postmodern post-colonialist world. Truth is totally subjective. What's the point? And I think she tries to make a good case against that, but I don't know if she ultimately uh, wins, quote unquote, on that respect, because a lot of people want certainty, they want reassurance, they want objectivity because that's what they crave. They crave a stability. Overall, people crave stability in their lives, so they need to have something to stabilize them, especially if they live lives that are full of hardships and full of trials and tribulations. So it's very very easy to fall into a paradigm where objectivity is totally solid. It's totally been worked out. All the answers are known. When they're not, we don't know everything. We barely even know ourselves. But at the same time, we can't have that. Having no stability is not an answer either. It's a very tight rope that we have to walk. At least At least I think. And after having fully read this, I think it only just reinforces that idea that there is a lot of nuance that that has to be covered, and to try to oversimplify things in the name of objectivity is probably not a course of action to take, in my opinion. So I guess that's it for this last part. Um, hopefully people can enjoy the reading, and it might be a little bit dry, but I think it was worth reading, and onward to other things, I suppose. So that'll be it for this one.